Well, good evening, friends. I've been asked to speak about what is Easter all about. And some of us have an idea that has something to do with a resurrection or empty tomb. Some have an idea that maybe it has something to do with Passover. But everyone, even people that don't have a Christian background, knows what it's really all about. Easter bunnies, colored eggs, etc. Okay. Well, friends, just as I shared with you back in December, we talk about Christmas kitsch. There's also Easter extravagances, and I am not going to get into that. We have strategically placed worldly-minded, unspiritual Christians at each one of your tables, and as we have our dialogue time, they can tell you all about the Easter bunny. But I'm going to move on from there. And because of that rather Babylonish background, some people have thought that Easter is simply a pagan holiday. It's borrowed from the word Ishtar, but that's actually not true, and you can find this anywhere. I'm just borrowing from Britannica. Early Christians would have a dawn service, and that was translated as Ostarum in Old High German. Some of you know German Ostern, Easter. It's just early, dawn comes up in the east, and that's where we got that name. But the Latin is Pascha, Greek, Pascha, Hebrew, Pesach, English, Passover. And so today, many countries use derivatives of that word to label Easter. Spanish, Pascua; French, Pâques; Italian, Pasqua. So Easter has something to do with this Passover. And before I get into that, I just need to touch on the fact that there were Passover controversies in the early centuries of the church. Now, the New Testament itself is silent on having an annual observance of Easter. The first evidence we have in this is about 180 of our common era, where we find some reference to a yearly Easter service. And there were many people who were followers of Jesus who were known as Quartodecimans. You ever run into one of those? It's a 14th day proponent. And the idea was that they were going to follow the Jewish calendar. Passover occurs on the 14th of Nisan, and they would always do it yearly, no matter when it fell. But of course, if you do it on the 14th of Nisan, you don't have 3 days later is Sunday. There were others that always wanted to do it on Sunday. Well, the Council of Nicaea, called by Constantine in 325, decreed that the first Sunday following the first full moon after the spring equinox, or March 21st, that's when Easter would be. They deliberately wanted to distance themselves from a Jewish calendar. And so this was just one example of many, many examples where we were being cut off from our Jewish roots. Now, I've moved my outline up to give myself more room to talk. And before I go into what the New Testament says about Easter, Passover, resurrection, I want to just point out something that Rabbi David Novak articulated a number of years ago in a very important article, and he talked about Hebraic monotheism, and this is better shown than told. So here's a little diagram. Over on your left-hand side, you have a little timeline going from 2000 BCE, before the Common Era, to 2000 CE, and I know there's no such year is zero, but just help me out here. That's what I need to show what I want to say. And he says, from the time of Abraham and the development of Moses, the covenant, the writings, we have the Tanakh, what we call the Old Testament, something that develops called Hebraic monotheism. And that includes the Tanakh, the Old Testament, plus Second Temple developments. That is, the temple was rebuilt, and the Old Testament canon, the Tanakh, is closed, but there are other writings, developments. The Sadducees, the Pharisees developed during this time. And then around about the first century, there is a response to this, and two different movements grow out of this that last to this day. There's Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism looks at this Hebraic monotheism through the lens of the Talmud. And likewise, Christianity looks through the lens of the New Testament and tradition. And both of these serve as sort of glasses, lenses through which we look. So both of them feel that they are just looking at the Word of God, the Old Testament, the Tanakh. But in fact, they are being influenced by Talmudic understandings, New Testament traditional understandings. And so neither of these groups imagine themselves branching off from this Hebraic monotheism. David Novak says, just as the Talmud could be called the Jewish New Testament, so also the New Testament could be called the Christian Talmud. Kind of interesting, isn't it? Each making commentary on this root of Hebraic monotheism. Now, the reality is, Rabbinic Judaism views itself as just the continuation of this Hebraic monotheism, and Christianity views itself as the continuation. I just wonder if there's kind of something in between these, and the Lord has yet a surprise for us. But with that understanding and what our host said earlier about we're coming to bring perspectives, I'm bringing a perspective coming from the New Testament. So that brings us to the Gospels. They're written in the form of a Greco-Roman biography. All scholars agree with that now, but it's a lot more than a Greco-Roman biography because of who it's about. Just like when we look in the Tanakh, that's like saying, well, the covenant that God made through Moses with the Israeli people, follows the standard suzerain treaties of that ancient world. Well, there is some of that pattern, but hey, there's a whale of a difference between a treaty made between a king and a vassal and the living God with his covenant people. So, yeah, Greco-Roman biography, but a whole lot more. Interestingly, 1/3 of the 4 Gospels text concern the last week of Jesus' life. Most biographies don't do that. So you got a couple of birth narratives, pretty much skips over his life, then it has about 3.5 years of ministry, but of that, it telegraphs down just to this last week of his life. And to perhaps oversimplify, but just for our purposes this evening, we can look at some Passover connections in this last week and the resurrection. So let me focus first on Passover connections. Very briefly, John the Baptist, the immerser, at the beginning of his ministry identifies Jesus as the Lamb of God. The Lamb is referenced 30 times in the book of Revelation, which a lot of people think about, well, that's all about end times, but actually it's a book about redemption. And then the Last Supper is a Passover meal. Jesus said to his disciples, how I've longed to have this meal with you. And so they are doing what Jewish people would have done at that time, and yet Jesus then imbues that meal with new significance. And he says, see this unleavened bread? This is now my body, which is broken for you. You see this cup with wine in it? This is now the cup of the new covenant in my blood for the forgiveness of sins. We have this passage in the New Testament, cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump. For Christ Messiah, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed for us. So this theme is there again and again and again. And we can see a few echoes of this. People of Israel would take initially a firstborn male without blemish and examine it from the 10th to the 14th of Nisan. Well, Jesus is the firstborn male of that household. He arrives on Palm Sunday, the 10th of Nisan, and he's examined for 4 days. The whole Passover supper is about deliverance from death and the power of Pharaoh, and that's what Jesus' death is all about, overcoming death and the powers, earthly powers, but also demonic powers. The blood was applied to the doorposts and the lintels of those ancient Hebrew dwellings, and here there's a picture of the blood being applied to the doors of our hearts. There was to be roasted lamb, and so this can be a picture of God, the Lamb, Jesus bearing God's anger against all sin. And then not directly related to Pesach or Passover, but we often reference the binding of Isaac, the Akedah. where Abraham says to Isaac, God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering. And then finally, Isaiah 53. Here's just a portion of it from the Jewish Publication Society. Surely our diseases he did bear and our pains he carried, whereas we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded because of our transgressions. He was crushed because of our iniquities. The chastisement of our welfare was upon him, and with his stripes we were healed. All we like sheep did go astray. We turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath made to light on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, though he humbled himself, and opened not his mouth, as a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and as a sheep that before her shearers is dumb. Yea, he opened not his mouth. And here again we see the lamb idea. And again, I'm well aware that rabbis would have a different interpretation of this, but I'm giving a perspective of that early Jewish community that viewed it another way. And now I want to move quickly to the whole idea of resurrection. We can just touch on this only briefly. But the hope of resurrection originates with the Jewish people. There's some argument as to whether the Persians, the Zoroastrians had it, but probably it originates with the Jewish people for a variety of reasons. And Jewish historian John Levinson points this out in Resurrection and the Restoration of Israel, the ultimate victory of the God of life. Resurrection is the 13th of Maimonides' 13 fundamental principles of the Jewish faith, so it's very important. That Messiah would die and rise again, particularly in history, was not expected, but it was foreshadowed. Jonah in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Yom HaBikurim, or the day of first fruits, which is observed during Passover on the 3rd day, and Messiah is referred to as the rising again, the first fruits from the dead. I mentioned before the Ha'akedah, the binding of Isaac, that here is one who's going to be slain, and yet there's a substitution for a lamb. And then we have various scriptures that have been viewed as messianic. They speak of David, particularly Psalm 16, Psalm 22, where he says, for example, Psalm 16:10, you will not suffer your Holy One to see corruption or abandon his soul in Sheol. We don't have time to develop all of these, but there's echoes here as well. Then we have Messiah ben David and Messiah ben Joseph. This was understood by the sages in the Talmud that there were going to be 2 Messiahs, a suffering Messiah, Messiah ben Joseph, and a triumphant Messiah, Messiah ben David. So one coming of 2 Messiahs. There's another view that would see 1 Messiah in 2 comings. Then we have this statement in the New Testament, and if Christ Messiah has not been raised, your faith is futile. So it's not enough to just take this as a metaphor. It's a good idea that gives us energy. Either he rose again or he didn't. This proves who he said he was. And so the New Testament takes some time to point out that there was an empty tomb. A body was never shown. Eyewitnesses in various numbers and circumstances, indoors, outdoors, morning, at night, by a lake, inland, indoors, outdoors. At one time, 500 people saw. And then finally, the 12, all except one, died martyrs' deaths. Now, people will die for a belief. They do that. Communists have done it. Various people of various religions. But you generally don't people finding themselves dying for a deliberate lie. So it's hard to imagine that the disciples just simply stole away the body. And so, friends, to conclude, this brings us to the beginning of the flowering of our redemption. Our Jewish friends recognize that as the line in a prayer that was given at the dedication of the state of Israel by the Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel. And he was viewing the birth of the state of Israel not as the redemption or even the beginning, but the beginning of the flowering of redemption. And I would say that the coming of Jesus into my heart has been like that. It's been life transforming, and yet I've got a long way to go. But I have a hope that there will be transformation. And not only for me, but even Jesus in bringing his kingdom. It was inaugurated. It starts small, but it has spread to the nations. and now is in every nation. And right now, every second someone dies worldwide, but also every second 3.5 people come into a saving relationship with what we believe to be the Messiah of Israel. And because of the teaching they're getting, they are also believing, and because we're very sensitive to resurrection, we believe also that what we see happening in Israel is the beginning of the flowering of redemption. And Ezekiel 37 in the Valley of Dry Bones speaks of the people of Israel being resurrected. And so there are billions of people that are for the Jewish people, and on their lips is Am Yisrael Kai. Thank you.